Let's go ahead and begin with a word of prayer this evening. Dear Lord, we thank you so much for your faithfulness. We thank you for the safe delivery of the child, and we just ask you be with her and allow her to grow close to you as she lives. We just ask you be with the family as they teach her your ways. Lord, be with us today in this time we have together, and may we learn about you and your mighty power to save. We ask all this in your precious name. Amen. Well, a little bit of a review from last week. We began with the 6th chapter of Daniel, and it kind of opened with the new ruler. Darius the Mede had conquered Babylon and taken over, and King Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom had fallen, and this new world power, the Medes and the Persians, had kind of entered onto the world stage and began. Darius, when he began his kingdom, set it up with himself at the top, and then underneath him were these three kind of head advisors, and then underneath them there were 120 satraps, and these satraps were kind of like the provincial governors and things like that to kind of govern the kingdom. Well, of those three advisors right underneath Darius, Daniel was one of those three. And it seems in history that those three governors, their task was primarily responsible to ensure that corruption didn't happen, that they kind of made sure that the 120 satraps were doing what they were supposed to be doing and getting the taxes into Darius that they were required to receive, to send to him. And he basically making sure Darius got all of the money that he kind of needed and was entitled to. For some reason, Daniel's two associates developed a dislike for him and wanted him removed. It might have been that they were a little bit on the corrupt side, and Daniel, being very honest, made it kind of impossible for them to skim off the top the kind of money that they wanted to get. Although that's really not stated in the text anywhere, but it's a good assumption based on what we know that these guys were supposed to be doing. And reading between the lines, they did some kind of an investigation to try and trap Daniel, and found in verse 4, Daniel 6, verse 4, they couldn't find any corruption against him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. So they, unable to find a legitimate way to get rid of Daniel, they hatched a conspiracy that they were confident was going to work. Their basic assumption was given in verse 5 from last week, where we read, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with his God." And so they presented a scheme to King Darius in verse 7 that the king was going to issue an edict and enforce a decree that anyone who prayed to any god or human other than Darius for the next 30 days would be thrown into the lion's den. Now, that started me thinking about lions in ancient times, and I've got a PowerPoint. I like PowerPoints. So we looked at this slide a couple of weeks ago. This is the Lion of Babylon sculpture right outside of the city of Babylon, and shows a lion pouncing on a human being. So lions were important. When Nebuchadnezzar had built the city of Babylon, the Ishtar Gate that we looked at a couple of weeks ago had various pictures of lions kind of built into the wall as decorations. And really, what I find amazing is some of the detail that is there. I mean, if you just look at this guy's teeth, you can see the teeth have been put into the mouth of this lion. It kind of makes him look pretty scary, if you ask me. Babylon wasn't the only place that had lions. The Macedonians, the Greeks, had a lion hunt a couple years after this. I had to edit the picture just a little bit in case some kid discovers this video. So what? This Macedonian lion hunt mosaic is found in Pella, Greece, and basically shows a couple people attacking lions and killing them. This would have been a couple hundred years or so after Darius and Daniel in the lion's den. But really, the most important lion story we have comes from a couple of hundred years before Daniel in the lion's den. The royal palace in Nineveh, where Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal lived, they liked to take rooms in their palace and carve into the walls important times during their kingships. And so the palace was excavated back in the late 1800s, early 1900s by people from the British Museum. Yay, British Museum! And they then took the walls of the palace to England and set them up in the British Museum. There is a room in there about, and one of the most fascinating rooms I found was the Lachish room. Lachish is a city in Israel, about 50 miles southwest of Jerusalem. And when King Sennacherib had just defeated the northern kingdom of Israel with its capital at Samaria, he marched on Jerusalem, but he had to conquer the city of Lachish first. And so he did. And when he conquered the city of Lachish, he then sent his army up to besiege Jerusalem. But while the army was besieging Jerusalem, Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, went to King Hezekiah and said, "Don't worry, Jerusalem will not fall. God will save us." And the Bible records in the book of Isaiah that night, the angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 Assyrians, soldiers. And as a result of that, Sennacherib obviously broke camp around Jerusalem and fled back to Nineveh. But when he got back up to Nineveh, he created in one of the rooms in his palace this Lachish room that described the Battle of Lachish. A slightly smaller room in the palace was created by Sennacherib's grandson, Ashurbanipal. And that's our subject tonight for a bit anyways. It's about a lion hunt that Ashurbanipal was involved in. And some of the pictures are just phenomenal artwork, actually carved into the wall. So let's jump to some of these pictures. This is what the room looks like right now in the British Museum. They've kind of put them up on the wall. You can see that there are sections of the wall that are missing. They're just gone. They were destroyed. But you can see in here the various pictures that have been carved into these panels that they have. And I've got close-ups of all of these. Some of these are just phenomenal pictures. And all carved, 2,500 years ago, 2,600 years ago. So this is a close-up. Actually, this is not a close-up. This is a little still further away picture of what the frieze kind of looks like on the wall. So let's get into lion hunting. Okay, so we have the king, probably Ashurbanipal himself. He's got a sword that he has stabbing the lion with. The lion has an arrow in his forehead. You have the armor bearer behind Ashurbanipal, give with the arrows and such that he would need to go hunt this particular lion. They also hunted lions on the back of chariots. Here, Ashurbanipal is shooting an arrow forward while his armor bearers are fighting the lion trying to jump on the chariot from behind. I'm sure they're not too happy. I bet you they wish that Ashurbanipal would turn around a little bit and kind of help him out a little bit there. Here's Ashurbanipal on horseback with a spear attacking the lion. Now look at this. This is just, I find this amazing. Okay. If you look at the horse, okay, the horse's legs are over here on this side of the lion. The horse's head is back behind the lion. And the lion's two legs are, front legs are on either side of it here. So basically the horse is running over the lion and Ashurbanipal is stabbing the lion at the same time. Just phenomenal artwork. Here's a lion that has been killed with a couple of arrows. You can even see they've carved into the frieze, into the lion, the wound marks of the blood dripping down from the lion's mane and beside the lion. Female lions, and it wasn't only male lions that were killed. Here's female lions with a couple of arrows in them. But look at the muscle tone on this picture. It's just amazing. You can see the muscles that they've put into the various. How do you carve that? I have no idea. That's just amazing. Another picture of a lion with a couple of arrows in it. This one also been killed, but again, you can look at its legs and see the detail that was carved. Just phenomenal. Here's a little bit further back. Again, here's the chariot with the guys killing the lions, but you can see there's at least 4 lions that are involved there in various states of having been killed during the hunt. Just phenomenal. What's interesting about lion hunting in ancient times was it was that sport of kings. It wasn't something like we think of in today when we go hunting. We go out in the woods and look around and see if we can find something. These lions were actually brought in to the king's animal park, I guess. The safari park if you're from Kenya, and so they're kind of released in order to be hunted, and we know that because we've actually got a picture of the cage that the animal is being let out of. They've brought the lion in from somewhere and kind of kept the lion. They're kept lions until it was time for the hunt. This is really important because it ties in directly with our lesson today. We're talking about Daniel and the lion's den. What kind of a lion's den was it? Well, they kept lions for these hunts, and they had to keep them somewhere. And so it seems to indicate in scripture anyways that that in Babylon there was a cistern of some kind or a cave of some kind where they kept the lions and then would bring them out for the hunt. This picture I just put in there because I love the horse's expression. He looks terrified, which, you know, if you have a lion gnawing on your hindquarters, I think you'd be terrified too. He just, save me. But even just looking at the bridle and all of the stuff that's on the horse, just the attention to detail is just phenomenal. Just amazing that they would carve that into the walls of the palace, and and Asher Bannerpaul could go in there and relive the experience of this lion hunt that he went on. It's pretty powerful. That last verse then, in verse 10 that we looked at last week, kind of is Daniel's response to this decree that King Darius had signed about being thrown into the lion's den. And Mom, do you have Daniel 6, verse 10?
When Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before.
And that's pretty much where we ended last week, with Daniel getting down and praying. And so we'll pick up today with verse 11 in Daniel chapter 6.
Okay. By the way, the only thing worse than trying to hunt lions that way would be thrown into a den with them. But we'll get to that. Verse 11 reads,
Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help.
No big surprise there. They were well aware of Daniel's habit of regular prayer. And not only did he do it regularly, but they were quite confident that he wasn't going to give up just because the law had been passed. And so they went and found him. And it says he was praying, asking God for help. The text does not tell us specifically what aspect of help he was looking for. I would think in all probability, he was asking God to help him to remain faithful and to face up to whatever the consequences were going to be of his praying. I can't help but believe that he knew exactly what was going on. He knew why that decree had been given, and he was prepared to pray regardless of what it means. I've tried to imagine how Daniel would have been viewed in those days. I'm sure a lot of people looked at Daniel and thought, what a pitiful example of a man who can't even stop praying for a few days. He's so stubborn. He's insisting on all of that. And I'm equally sure that the angels in heaven were saying, wow, what a faithful servant, willing to put God first. And when it comes right down to it, those are usually our choices. Do we look odd out of it in the eyes of the world? Probably, but that's not the one we're trying to please. Verse 12 records the moment that Daniel's enemies got the evidence they wanted, and they rushed to the king. Verse 12 reads,
So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royalty decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being, except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed.
Before telling the king while they were there, they wanted to double check that the decree that he had issued was in a force. It was irrevocable. And the moment the king Darius acknowledged that that was indeed a binding rule, they were just so ready to share what they had. And they evidently sensed that Darius liked Daniel, obviously having promoted him and so forth. So they knew that what they were about to tell him was not going to be popular. So let's make sure where we stand on this rule before we do it. Otherwise, we could be in trouble. As soon as Darius confirmed the edict, the two of them reported what they had seen. And again, I try to picture things going on because this happens in real time with real people. And I can picture one of them who's been assigned to be the spokesman saying, King Darius, with heavy hearts, we have to report to you that one of us, Daniel, exactly has. And then they went on to tell the whole thing. While they were pretending, I'm sure, to be so upset that they had to report it, in their own hearts and minds, they were saying, yeah, we got him. He's fixed on this one. And then they said, according to verse 13,
Then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day.
There are a number of interesting things to note about that. First of all, they immediately noted that he was an exile from Judah. That was a way of saying he's really not one of us, you know. He's been brought here as a slave. And of course, if he's an exile and a slave, he's not going to be very likely to want to support you. He'd rather overthrow you and go back where he was. Loyalty to you as a king, that's not something that slaves do in exiles. And not only that, but his disobedience wasn't just, oh, he accidentally forgot about it. He did it 3 times a day. Can you imagine being that disloyal to you? And he said that he's paying no attention to you, which was their way of saying he really isn't being loyal. He did not care what you, the king, had said. The fact that the king himself had signed that decree seemed to be ignored and was further evidence that he was disrespecting the king. And it wasn't just a slip on his part. He said he'd been doing it 3 times a day.
Well, in verse 14, we get Darius's response. Verse 14 says that when the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. Some question has been asked about what does that mean? What does it mean when it says Darius was greatly distressed? Well, it could mean that he was distressed that Daniel, a trusted official, had betrayed him. And unfortunately, as the chapter progresses, we find that does not seem to be the problem. Doesn't seem to be worried about Daniel. A second possibility as to why Darius is distressed is that he likes Daniel, and he was going to have to throw Daniel into the lion's den. He'd made the decree, and so he's got to get rid of one of his friends, and he doesn't really want to do that. I think that would be distressing for just about anyone. A third possibility is that Darius suddenly realizes that his advisors, whom he had trusted, had at the least, he tricked him into this situation, and more probably they had deliberately sought to control Darius and by trying to get him to do what he now regretted he had to sign. And I think he might have figured out all of a sudden, these guys are not good guys. And if that's the case and word gets out that he had failed this way, he had hired, promoted some unscrupulous people, that could throw into doubt the king's ability to lead, and his entire government might be put in question. What about the other 120 satraps under them? Are they loyal, or are they trying to cause problems? And so, for whatever reason, Darius is greatly distressed. And the verse kind of goes on from there and to declare that Darius was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. But Darius didn't want to lose Daniel, and Daniel was a valuable member of his government. Unfortunately, because of this law of the Medes and the Persians, there was no loophole in the law, in the decree, that would allow him to back off and not punish Daniel for praying. The law had been set. Daniel had broken the law. Even though Darius might have been tricked into signing the law was the law, and even the king has to obey the laws at some point. The interesting thing is that Daniel also knew this law and knew that the application of the law would bring failure to Darius. Daniel also knew that by following God's law, well, God's law wasn't a failure. God's law was perfect. And we see that the psalmist writes in Psalm 19, verse 7 and 8, he kind of declares that same kind of, he kind of describes it this way, Mom.
The law of the Lord is perfect, refreshing the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, giving joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are radiant, giving light to the eyes.
And unfortunately, Darius's laws don't measure up to God's laws. And Daniel understood that, and probably Darius understood a little bit of that at this point too. And then, as if Darius needed to be reminded after trying to save Daniel the whole time, in verse 15, Daniel's enemies show back up and kind of go to the king and say, hey, king, remember, we got to deal with Daniel. And there was no way to escape that fact. The law was binding. End of story as far as they were concerned. And so in the beginning of verse 16, the decree is carried out. Daniel is taken and thrown into the lion's den. Now, Darius was definitely not happy. And so the last half of the verse of 16 says, the king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. And that's a very powerful statement. The picture is that of Darius kind of like standing over the pit and calling down to Daniel as he's being lowered into this pit. And we're not sure what Darius is trying to say. You know, is it a prediction that God was going to rescue Daniel? Or is it maybe a wish that God would rescue him? And I think if it's a wish that God would rescue him, I think that tells us a little bit about Darius, to think that something like that was even possible. Maybe Darius had heard some of the miracles that Daniel had performed with God's power. And, maybe he'd heard the stories of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and understood that Daniel's God was a powerful God. And so maybe he's wishing that Daniel's God would rescue him. And it might be that it's kind of a sign of failure on Darius's part to rescue him, but a hope that it's not the end. And this could be a way of Darius saying, I couldn't help you, but maybe your God can. And I think it's very interesting. Given all that follows, it seems more likely that it's a wish. I'm really hoping. I wish your God would rescue you. However, when we get down to verse 20, we'll discover that Darius, although he might have hoped for a rescue, certainly did not expect it to actually happen. That phrase, your God whom you serve continually, definitely does say something about Daniel's faith and commitment. And there's no doubt about it, if as Christians we want to have a witness to those around us, we need to be consistent in our walk with the Lord. Darius knew that Daniel served God continually. Unfortunately, in our churches, we have a lot of people that are Sunday-only Christians who don't make much of an impact for Jesus in our world. And the EC denomination has sometimes been called Easter Christmas people. and those even have less impact on our world. Darius hoped that Daniel's God could rescue him. And I find that very interesting because that's kind of the same word that's used by King Nebuchadnezzar a couple chapters before in talking to Daniel's three friends. The difference is that when Nebuchadnezzar talked about rescuing him, Nebuchadnezzar says, your God can't rescue you. He won't rescue you. Darius turns around and says, man, I hope he does rescue you. It tells us a lot about who Daniel is and who Nebuchadnezzar is. We can only imagine what Daniel might have said to Darius as they're walking towards the lion's den. There's no record of any talking between them in Scripture. I kind of would love to have been a fly on the wall, or a lion in the den in this case, and listen to to what Daniel was telling Darius. We don't know. Must have been very interesting.
I find verse 17 rather fascinating to think about. It talks about the security that was provided to make sure that Daniel did not escape from the lion's den when he was being cast into it. Now, again, we don't have a full picture, but from what we can learn, their lion's den was probably similar to what we might see today in a zoo or wherever. The lions would have been kept in half of a cage, which is where they would sleep and so forth. And then at feeding time, they would open a gate into the second half of that crypt or that den area. And while the animals were being fed, then their keepers would take care of that, the sleeping area, the other compartment that was in it. When they entered into the feeding area, they were usually extremely hungry. They didn't overfeed them. Too much cost involved in that. So the moment that food was dropped, being so hungry, they pounced on it. And while they were doing that, the keepers, as we said, were being fed. And so they decided that when they put Daniel in, they were going to do a number of different things. Again, I don't know why they did it, because in theory, they should have known that before he hit the ground, he would have been devoured by these lions. But assuming for some reason he was able to get by them, can you picture the guard saying, well, you know what, we better do something because this 80-year-old man could jump out of the, trust me, at 80, you don't jump out of anything on it, but
Hard enough time getting out of your chair. So
yeah, for sure. In case something goes wrong, Artie, you got that verse? A stone?
Yep, a stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed.
Okay, we're going to dump him in. Hungry lions. We're going to put a stone over it. We're going to seal it so no one can touch it. And that should take care of it. And now, every now and then, somebody comes along who's a critic of Scripture and says, oh, that's easy enough to explain. The lions weren't really hungry that day. Well, that sounds good, except if we read on, which we will, when we get to verse 24, and they throw his adversaries, his enemies in, we read there that before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. They were hungry, but verse 18 notes how Darius responded to that whole affair. It records that the king returned to his palace, spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him. He could not sleep. This is a rather interesting picture, and in some ways, an interesting contrast between Darius and Daniel. But it's a picture of Darius who is tremendously upset about the events that have taken place. None of the usual things that he would have done to help him sleep were any good. Meantime, I can picture Daniel snuggled up next to one of those lions having a good nap and the whole thing. Both the king and the lions fasted that night for different reasons. The Aramaic word for entertainment is found only here. Translators aren't sure what to do with it. Generally, it's thought that it referred to having music played for the king when he was upset and couldn't sleep. You might remember that David played for King Saul when he couldn't sleep at night on it. That didn't work. Evidently, Darius did not have any songs on his playlist that were appropriate for a night like that. I think we do have here, though, an interesting contrast that we might see even today between a non-Christian who has no help sleeping when things aren't going well, and the Christian who, in the midst of adversaries of any kind, adversity, can rest in the Lord. Really does make a difference. Now, obviously, Darius admired and liked Daniel, could not sleep. So in verse 19, it records that at the first light of dawn, he rushed off to the lion's den to check on Daniel's status. Again, we can only imagine what he expected to find. Some commentators, many commentators, wonder if in the back of Darius's mind wasn't the idea that occasionally criminals would be put in a situation that they called trial by ordeal. You put a person in a situation where they could be harmed or killed, and if they survive, that means they were innocent. It sounds good, and it actually begins to have some support by Daniel, who later on is going to say, I was found innocent in God's sight, nor have I done anything wrong before you. However, the one factor that doesn't play into it is that trial by ordeal was normally used in a case where we're not sure if this person is innocent or guilty. So if we put them in a situation where they could die or whatever, and they do, then they were obviously guilty. If they survived, then they were obviously innocent. In this case, there was no question of guilt. He prayed 3 times in front of everybody, and they saw him there.
So verse 20, Darius shows up at the lion's den, and he calls out in an anguished voice. And that kind of shows that he is deeply concerned about Daniel's condition, and probably, reflects his doubt that Daniel has survived the night, this anguished voice. And the last part of verse 20 is a really interesting passage, because Darius says, Daniel, the servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lion's den? We can only imagine what Darius was expecting for an answer. Well, he was probably not expecting an answer, because Darius knew how unlikely it was that Daniel had survived. The interesting things that I find in Darius's question to Daniel is the reference to Daniel's God as the living God. That kind of is interesting, because we wonder if Daniel knew about Yahweh. Did he recognize the truth of who Daniel's God was? That phrase, living God, is used in Scripture almost exclusively by the Israelites when they wanted to make a comparison between the true God and the false idols of the nations around them. The fact that Darius here is using this in addressing Daniel probably implies that he had heard Daniel refer to his God that way, and maybe thought it was a proper title for Daniel's God to use in reference to him being rescued. Verse 21 simply reports that Daniel politely says to the king, "O king, live forever," which is pretty funny if you're Darius. I have no idea what was going through Darius's mind at that point. Daniel, you okay? Yep, I'm here, king. What? Daniel's adversaries had addressed Darius that same way. May the king live forever. Oh, king, live forever. When they were approaching him with his plans, theirs was a little different. They were following protocol. Daniel was showing the respect that he believed Darius deserved. And I kind of wonder if it's not maybe Daniel's way of saying to the king, King, this is King Darius, may you live forever. This is not your fault, okay? Now, I'm not holding a grudge against you because you threw me into the lion's den. Even though maybe Daniel thought that Darius could have saved him, probably not. I think Daniel was as much a scholar of the law as he was of the Bible, and probably knew that Darius couldn't have done anything. And just trying to imagine Darius's face at this point, not only was Daniel spared, for which Darius had to be happy, but Darius was able to have a clear conscience about it. He did not have to feel guilty about Daniel's death in this case. Well, in fact, he didn't die at all. In verse 22, we have a description of what happened from Daniel's perspective.
My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty.
Isn't that an interesting phrase, how Daniel refers to Yahweh as my God? Daniel's relationship with God was very personal, made more personal by regularly spending time with him in prayer. Daniel not only had that personal relationship with God, but was always quick to give God glory for everything that happened to him. And Daniel begins his announcement to Darius that God sent his angel. Who was that angel? We don't know. Maybe he was just an angel, or maybe it was the same angel that came and visited Rakshak and Benny in the fiery furnace. Sometimes in the Old Testament, the phrase angel of the Lord is actually used to describe God himself. And maybe it was God himself that showed up and helped Daniel out. Some have suggested that it might be even the pre-incarnate Jesus showing up to help Daniel. The Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, suggests that this angel was God himself showing up to be with Daniel for the night. Whoever it was, Daniel clearly saw him. He tells Darius, an angel came and shut the mouths of the lion. And so, like Dad mentioned earlier, I kind of picture Daniel all that night, sleeping on a bed made of angel's wings with a big kitty cat curled up next to him, keeping him warm at night. Darius is tossing and turning, and Daniel's having the best night of his life. God, I find it interesting that God could have very easily kept Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego out of the fiery furnace. It chose not to. God could very easily have kept Daniel out of the lion's den, and chose not to. I mean, think how much more glory God receives when, instead of preventing difficulties, he allows people to go through the difficulties and brings them through. Obviously, Darius was overjoyed with Daniel being alive, and after he picked his jaw up off the ground, verse 23, he orders that his servants help Daniel out of the pit. And a very interesting last section, the last half of that verse. Mom, can you read the last half of that verse?
When Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him. because he had trusted in his God.
That passage just parallels so nicely with the three men in the fiery furnace. When they came out of the fiery furnace, there was no smell of smoke on them. When Daniel comes out of the lion's den, there's not a scratch on him. Now, in Kenya, I had a number of cats over the years. And if you have a cat and you play with a cat for any length of time, you're going to get scratched. It's just a matter of fact. I would think lions would scratch even harder. Daniel came out of that lion's den after spending a night with the lions, and they're really just big kittens, aren't they? He did not even have a scratch on him. The key to God's performing the miracle of allowing Daniel to survive the night is listed there in that passage, because Daniel trusted in his God.
Okay, I'm going to move quickly here because this next section is in the handout that either our folks got at church or on Dan's website. But the early church picked up on what they saw as a similarity between Daniel's experience in the lion den and the death and resurrection of Jesus. And they viewed this almost as a typology, a picture of what Jesus was going to go through. And on that handout, just some of the things that they note: Daniel was framed on false charges, as was Jesus. Daniel's accusers went to the government authorities. The same thing here. Daniel was arrested while at prayer. Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. Darius worked for his release. Pilate said, "I find no fault in him." Both of them were turned over to others for execution. Both put in, after their death, or in Daniel's case, before he died, in a secure place with a stone rolled in front of it, over it, with a seal from the government on it. Darius rushed to the tomb early in the morning. So did the women, and both emerged alive from the tomb. And there was a major difference, however, and Daniel got out of the tomb den without a scratch. Jesus bears the marks of that crucifixion forever. And came across, actually, Dan sent me a link to an article on Daniel in the lion's den, looking at some of the early church history regarding that. And there's a tremendous number of paintings and that kind of thing that picture that in the early church. One interesting reference is from a 4th century commentary by Didymus, and he compared Daniel's lion den with the image of hell, perhaps pushing it just a bit. But they saw a lot of similarities there, and were able to say, hey, you know what, this pictures for us what Jesus went through on our behalf. Get to verse 24, and it simply records that Daniel's accusers, along with their families, were thrown into the den. And as we noted earlier, they were devoured by the very lions that had ignored Daniel. Now, that seems rather harsh to us, that you would throw the accusers and their families in. First of all, this was a period of time in which we didn't hear about, unfair treatment of prisoners and all those kinds of things. The idea was that they had failed and it was going to cost them dearly. They knew that when they went into it. The idea of their families, again, seems harsh to us. But again, that was a culture in which it was expected that one's family would revenge one's death, so that if any of the family survived, those accusers' families survived, it would be expected that they would follow up by killing others who were a part of it and cause their parents, their dad to get put to death. So this way they put them all aside. You didn't have to worry about it. We really don't know how many were involved in this because we don't know how many were actually involved in reporting to the king. We noted earlier, it says, they all showed up. That was the way the advisors put it, but we know they didn't all do that. Then in verses 25 to 27, we have Darius's decree concerning the God of Daniel. In the first part of that decree says, every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. That's a much broader declaration than what King Nebuchadnezzar had issued earlier in chapter 3. There in chapter 3, King Nebuchadnezzar said, no one better speak ill of Daniel's God. Here the implication is that he is to be worshiped with fear and reverence. Darius describes Daniel's God as the living God who endures forever. The implication is that God is not only alive, but because he is alive, he can act. And I think we need to keep that in mind. We have a living God who is there for us. He acts on behalf of his people. And not only is he alive and acting, but his reign is forever. He goes on and says his kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. I don't think Darius had the foggiest idea what he was saying. I don't think there was any way he could appreciate that. But you know what? On this side of the cross, in this side of the resurrection, and all of the information we have in the New Testament, we can truly say his dominion will never end. The kingdom is coming. He has set it up, and it's going to reign forever and ever. Darius then listed among the things that God does. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders. Obviously, he had just seen one and was well aware of what had happened for Daniel and truth to God's activity. And then finally, in verse 28, it closes out with Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius, the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And with that, we have the end of what we call the historical section of the book of Daniel. We're going to begin next week looking at some of the visions and dreams and prophecies of Daniel. This was the history up till now. Those dreams and so forth that will show up next week fit back into different periods of this history. Again, on your notes that you have either handout or from Dan is a long list of things from Paul House's commentary. And I just thought it was such an excellent review of some of the key points in the book of Daniel to this point. They're there for you to go over. Margie, go on Dan's site and get them on it.